North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, will celebrate its 75th anniversary on Thursday. And for this, the bloc's foreign ministers are meeting on Wednesday and Thursday to discuss military support for Ukraine in the days ahead. My colleague Nick Harper is in Washington, D.C. He gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Nick, U.S. Foreign Secretary Antony Blinken in Brussels now?
That's right, Tanvi. After wrapping up his Paris trip, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken reached Brussels for the crucial NATO meeting. In Paris, Blinken said NATO was looking at measures that could serve as the necessary bridge to the alliance's membership for Ukraine. The top US diplomat met France's defence minister, as well as French President Emmanuel Macron, and held talks with his French counterpart, Stéphanie Séjourné, underscoring the ongoing collaboration with Europe in supporting Ukraine. A proposal for a $108 billion funding package for Ukraine is on the table as NATO foreign ministers meet in Brussels. The two-day meeting aims to have an aid package finalised in time for the NATO summit, which will be held here in Washington, D.C. in July. The proposal by NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg would give the Western alliance a more direct role in coordinating the supply of arms and equipment to Ukraine.
Ministers will discuss how NATO could assume more responsibility for coordinating military equipment and training for Ukraine, anchoring this within a robust NATO framework. We will also discuss a multi-year financial commitment to sustain our support.
Ukraine. Not as NATO commemorates its 75th anniversary this week, Russia has asserted that the alliance has now reverted to a Cold War mindset.
Today, in relations with Russia, the bloc has returned to Cold War settings. In its doctrinal documents, our country is proclaimed, direct quote, the most significant direct threat, end quote. There is an active build-up of the military potential on the eastern flank. Military drills, unprecedented in size, against Russia are conducted. They aren't even trying to cover it up.
Well, to get more on all of this, we're joined by DD India's Ishan Garg, who's live in Brussels for us. Ishan, let's start with this aid package. What more do we know about this more than $100 billion package for Ukraine?
Well, essentially the idea for this package, according to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, is to provide Ukraine with some long-term view over what kind of funding it's going to have access to. Jens Stoltenberg says that for Ukraine to be able to plan its offensives well, it needs to have that sort of visibility. And the other idea is, of course, to have NATO allies pool their money to contribute to a fund in a more structured way, and they shouldn't be contributing in an ad hoc manner. So the idea is that member countries should prioritize having a framework that they can use to give this money to Ukraine through a fund and not rely on voluntary contributions throughout the year. So it kind of solves two purposes at the same time. The idea would be that different NATO countries will be able to chip into this fund based on their economies, the size of their economies, the same way the budget for NATO is decided. So it will be decided by the relative GDPs of different countries. We are not, of course, expecting it to be signed off on at this summit, but this will set the stage up for the leaders to discuss it and perhaps take it up later in July in Washington when NATO leaders meet there.
And Ishan, NATO has also been doing some future planning, looking at ways to protect US involvement in the alliance, even if Donald Trump is re-elected in November's US presidential election.
Well, the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency certainly looms large on this meeting, and one of the ways in which NATO is looking at quote-unquote future-proofing that sort of idea is by potentially having the Ramstein Group, the Ukraine Contact Group, which is a grouping of 40 different countries that coordinate military supplies to Ukraine. The idea would be that NATO takes over some of those responsibilities, if not all of that. Now, this is all being discussed here in Brussels. There is no clear indication implementation of that, how that will go. But Jens Stoltenberg has said that US being a part of NATO alliance, US being in a position to sort of guide those conversations and those discussions that have happened at the Ramstein Group's meetings remains crucial. But what this will allow NATO to do is take up a lot of those responsibility in terms of coordination in case there is a reduction in US's role within the Ramstein Group or within NATO as well in the future.
Ishan, thank you. That was Ishan Garg joining us live from Brussels.